Welcome to Mysteries of Writing, where many topics are taken into deeper perspective. Today's episode will cover why revising your writing could be challenging, especially after completing the first draft. After writing the first draft, or if you have a tendency of editing as you write, revising might seem like a daunting task. So, when it comes to revisions, it is a lot of writers' least favorite thing to do. Let's be honest. And the last thing writers want to do, or just anyone in general, is to look back at their work. They see it in a subjective view. In other words, we tend to focus on the emotions and the opinions rather than the actual facts and what is actually needs to be adjusted. We are so heavy minded on our stories that we just finished and always wanted to see come to life that we tend to like to forget that this writing needs some polishing. It has some work to do. But newer writers would assume that revisions are not necessary. But here's a hard truth. Your writing sucks. Even for me, like still in the beginning stages of writing, my writing probably sucks. There's some things that I haven't done, and I'm just still learning. And I am continuing to grow my craft in writing to see what I do best and what I need to work on. And I can definitely relate to revisions because I can look at a story and be like, you know what? It looks good. It's great. But the mistake is my mindset is just so focused on the story and all its potential. And I seem not to want to work on it and see where there needs to be improvements. I've been just laying off the revision process. And isn't it okay to lay the revision process off? Yes, for some time, so you can look at your story in a new, fresh perspective. However, just skipping the revision step altogether is a mistake. And you do not want to regret not editing your story. But on the flip side, you can revise your writing so many times and still not get that particular thing right. And identifying the flaws that are in your writing. And if you cannot identify the flaws in your writing, how can you expect to get better? How can you expect any progress moving forward? How can you expect that you don't make the same mistakes in future writings, whether it's a short story, novella, or even a novel? No matter what length of a story that you write, you need to make sure you make changes because changes are necessary in order to improve your writing. And revisions can happen at any type of editing. But the big three that we're going to focus on today are line editing, copy editing, and developmental editing. What are these type of editing things that I just talked about? So line editing is going line by line to to see to see the small things in the story. You are not worrying about the big picture or just like paragraph by paragraph. It's line by line. You're reading word for word, seeing what makes sense, what doesn't, and you're changing like that. Copy editing is whenever you revise the material to make it more readable and more quality. And then developmental editing is seeing the bigger picture, your story, your characters, the plot, the overall tone that is set in the story. And it is good to have all three in your toolbox because if you have one and not the others, then it's still going to feel like a lackluster story. And we as writers, we as readers, do not want lackluster stories. We want it to be the best story we can make it. And how we can do that, we had to have a polished writing and looks like a book that is currently up in the market. And revising your writing is essential of having a quality story. And speaking of quality story, let's talk about quality versus quantity. So, basic difference is quality is how good or bad something is. Quantity is how much of something. So, you might have heard the term bigger is better. Well, not necessarily. Bigger might not necessarily be better. Bigger might be worse. And sometimes less could be more. So when you are writing your story, it doesn't have to be at the get-go, but having a good idea of how long you want your story, but at the same time thinking about how you can make it good. Let me say, no, great. How can you make the story great? That is the ultimate goal when you are trying to write a story from any length. But with high quality, but somewhat of lack of quantity is all right. But how come a high of quantity and low of quality is not okay? Well, like I said before, bigger is not necessarily better. Because in a book, so you know those chunky books that have hundreds of pages in it, there could be so much filler or something to keep the story going or just prolong it. But you really want to get in the point of your writing. And how does this relate to revisions and all that stuff? I'll get there in a minute. But you want to be mindful of what goes into your story, of what needs to be in your story and what needs to stay away from your story. Because the things that you need are those essential things to move the plot forward, or some characters that needs to be developed. You need to take the time and have that all come together to make a complete story. But having all this extra stuff like info dump or even like some extra places the characters go, or even like just talk about their day-to-day life like 24/7. That's not needed. Because in a story with these books, we the readers, we the audience are trying to get to what is happening next. And we don't need a info dump like this is what happened. Da, 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 da. No, because that is going to get us out of the story and keep us from reading what's next. The goal is to get to what is next. And more of that filler, having more of that filler could drain the quality of your story that you're trying to tell. Because you can have this great plot, great world building, great characters, but you just put too much. Now, how does quality and quantity relate to revising? Well, when you're revising, you're trying to figure out what to add and what to cut out, what is too much and what you need more of. And once again, you're identifying those flaws that you possibly have in your writing, and you are making adjustments. When you're revising, you're continuously making adjustments. You're reading through it and seeing what you can do to make it better. But let's say if it's not broken, don't fix it. And a good example of that is, okay, you have this great plot, okay? So don't try to add things that would distract from moving the plot forward. Well, hopefully your story is character driven and not all plot driven where your characters are punchbacks. But my point is, that you want to advance the plot. You want to keep the story moving forward and not taking steps back. Because the more steps that you take back, the less momentum that you're getting into the story and the less progress you're making. Unless that story is a slow burn and you need that slow progression to get to the ultimate payoff. But a lot of times we are eager and impatient to get to the end. And with revisions, you are always battling between quality and quantity. And sometimes it can be really tempting in the revisions that you add more, which that could drain your quality. But if you put quality first, then your story will mean so much more. And you will feel like you have the story that you want to tell. Let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so you're a great writer. You love writing stories and all that. You've been doing it since you were young. But you're not so great as an editor. That's okay. Okay? Because we all have our strengths and weaknesses. We could write this great essay, this great article or whatever, but maybe our grammar kind of sucks. Or maybe we have some sentences that not everyone might understand or see your point of what you're saying. But you don't want to dumb it down in a way that's like, oh, it's so obvious. Why did you not say it like this? You know what I mean? And sometimes we will need that additional support to help us in the areas that we might be lacking in. Let's get deeper into the editing part. You might be great at the developing part of editing with knowing what's the bigger picture and knowing what your story about and how all these parts come together as one. But you might lack in the line editing and copy editing, the smaller things that you might not be able to see a first read, or maybe a second. But that's why we read so many times to familiarize ourselves with the story, so we know what we're dealing with. But it could also be vice versa. You might be good at the line and copy editing, knowing those small little details that someone wouldn't catch. But you have a hard time knowing the structure of your story. You know what happens, but how it's structured overall, uh, it kind of feels matte. It kind of feels like something undercooked. If you have a hard time editing your story, you can find a trustworthy person who knows what they're doing and will provide constructive feedback from an objective viewpoint. And when it comes to someone else reading your story, this can be beta readers or editors or even someone who knows what they're doing and knows what they're looking for whenever they're reading a book, or even someone writes a story. They can pinpoint the things that you wasn't aware about. And a lot of times it's unintentional. We expect the story to be flawless and everything is all right. However, when someone else sees something, they're going to be like, "Oop, there's a flaw," and they can tell you about it, and they'll give you their honest opinion. And I want to talk about an objective viewpoint because it is different from subjective, like I said earlier, which focuses on the feelings and emotions. But the objective viewpoint focuses on the facts and the agenda. And whenever you allow someone else to read your story, they have an agenda to find whatever in your story is at its low point and bring it to the high points of where you do best at. And they want the best for you, not the worst. If they wanted the worst, they would probably lie to you. Or they probably be like, oh, I read it. No, you didn't. You didn't read it. Uh, oh, I may have it. Just to let it sit there forever and never touch it. And the writer will never get their feedback because you have just left it in the dust. But if you're not ready to share your writing or you feel quite insecure, there are many writing softwares that you can use that can help guide you with the editing process. And it's so much easier. And also, it tells you about the different things like grammar, style, structure. It will break it down to where you can understand it and something that you can work with. And after you have that polish and when you're ready to finally have someone to read it and see what they think about it, you can definitely do that. What to take away from this episode? Number 1, what you the writer sees might not be from an objective viewpoint. So earlier when I was talking about reading your story so many times but failing to see what flaws there are, you're looking through a subjective viewpoint that you're reading based on feelings and emotions and not necessarily like the facts. So like what is in your story that is probably slowing the story, what is slowing it down that is hard to read or is something unreadable, because you don't want your story to come to a point that is unreadable and everyone just wants to put it out. But if it's necessary for you to just put it down and shove it into a corner for however long so you can get that fresh mindset so you can think more objectively, or you can give it to someone that you trust and knows enough about writing to see what flaws that are in the story, and they provide you constructive feedback so you can fix it. Number 2, there are different types of revising and editing techniques, and I went over 3 today, which is line editing, copy editing, and developmental editing. Remember, there's differences between these main 3. So line editing is going line by line, word by word. Copy editing is revising the writing to make it more readable and more quality. And developmental editing is getting that bigger picture of the story with the plot, characters, world building, etc. And most importantly, number 3, know your strengths and weaknesses when writing. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We have our ups and downs. But if you are able to identify what those strengths and weaknesses are, you will be able to know what you should do in your writing and what to possibly avoid. And hopefully you're not making the same mistakes in future writings. Do not take the revising and editing step for granted, because that is crucial if you want a quality story.